Okay, so now that you've seen part one, I'm going to trust we now understand that mass deportations are not intended to be helpful to the economy or to the people of this nation. If you haven't heard me go through the mathematics of that claim, I suggest you take a listen to it before continuing here. I'm not a lawyer, but I do have some understanding of legal language, and as always, I encourage you to cross-reference everything I say with lawyers who shed light on this topic. When you do, you will see why I'm making this essay, because I have heard maybe 24 lawyers shed light on this topic, and I have found their advice, though pertinent, woefully insufficient, because the advice of these lawyers seems to include the assumption that ICE agents will respect human rights and not break laws. There seems to be an assumption on their part that enduring agents and officers breaching rights and law can be sorted out in the courts in the future. I like this idea, but history has proven the possibility of other outcomes, and it's good to be aware and to be prepared. However, today, before we even talk about what to do in the events of the ICE knock-in talks, we do have to discuss what human rights are, as well as what common rhetoric is inciting the violation of them. Though the president's tweets are obviously not any kind of legally binding policy, I do want to explore the sentiments of one in particular. On February 17th, 2025, the current president, who has already pardoned over 1,000 people, tweeted the following: "He who saves his country does not violate any law." I think it stands to reason that the possibility exists where ICE agents who break laws and are found guilty of the crimes they commit are pardoned anyway. So we have to acknowledge that under the current administration, the legal process of protecting rights may be increasingly impeded. This unfortunately puts citizens in a situation where, in addition to trusting law, individuals and communities have to prepare for the means of protecting rights, even if laws fail to protect them. Though this may not be the case, as citizens, as people with an understanding of history, it would be morally irresponsible to ignore this possibility. Now we can get into the crux of what we want to talk about today. The United Nations asserts in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. The key takeaway here is that rights are something that you have, period, innately, for being alive on this earth. You own your rights as much as you own your body or mind. Even if the government or enforcers claim that you don't have rights. Really, what the struggle for rights is the struggle to mold society into one that acknowledges, respects, and protects rights. For example, you own the right to use your voice and express your ideas, not because it's listed in the Bill of Rights, but because you are a living being with ideas and a voice. If a government removes it from the Bill of Rights, they are not removing your right. They are removing their acknowledgement of it and ending their systems that intended to respect and protect it. So when we speak of liberation struggles, we do not ask for rights. We assert our boundaries that the conditions of our society will respect and protect them. This needs to be understood because a common misconception in the US is that your government gives you rights, making your self-ownership something dependent on the permission of the government. This is not how the world at large understands rights. Since this essay addresses the human rights violations of ICE, I want to include an example of what dangerous sentiments and misconceptions are out there in the zeitgeist. I will briefly go through some quotes from a member of Congress and shed some light on what's incorrect about her words in terms of law. So we'll watch and listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene.
I certainly hope we do open as many prisons as possible to round up as many illegal aliens that have invaded our country.
Already, we need to stop for multiple reasons. Immigrants being undocumented is a civil matter. In terms of the law, undocumented immigrants are not considered criminal. The idea of opening more prisons to deal with a civil matter is an attempt to criminalize 11 million people. When we look at history in 1930s Germany, it's important that we understand the Jews and other outgroups became fugitives. They were not fugitives because they committed crimes. They were fugitives because they existed in a country whose government decided they weren't welcome and criminalized their existence. Thus, what she's referring to building are not prisons, but concentration camps. The language here, illegal aliens, implies that human beings can exist illegally. In the framework of international law, this is incorrect. There's no such thing as a human being existing outside of self-ownership and the rights that implies. Green's use of the word invasion is no doubt hyperbolic, but just to specify against the sentiment, in terms of international law, invasion is one state sending troops into another state to occupy territory against the consent of the invaded state. It is clearly defined as a military action. Obviously, non-combatants fleeing to a land from all over does not constitute as an invasion. She continues.
And those that are breaking our laws, killing our citizens, women and children, and causing complete havoc across our great land.
We see this migrant crime myth pop up a lot, and it's been debunked many times, but as of 2020, in an article for the National Library of Medicine, journalists Light, He, and Roby found that, quote, relative to undocumented immigrants, U.S.-born citizens are over 2 times more likely to be arrested for violent crimes, 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes, and over 4 times more likely to be arrested for property crimes, unquote. Now, this of course isn't a perfect metric of criminality because this is based on number of arrests and not convictions. But there are plenty of angles that people have taken to disprove the idea that immigrants are more criminal than U.S.-born citizens, and I encourage you to find any number of them. She continues.
For the Democrats and the Biden administration that ripped our border open and allowed this illegal alien monster to come into our country.
The Biden administration did not have an open border policy. That administration followed the footsteps of Trump's first term. Trump's first term, deportations were 1.5 million. Biden's deportations are estimated to be between 1.5 and 1.8 million, according to the Migration Policy Institute.
The Democrats on the other side of the aisle complain and whine and defend illegal aliens that break the law the minute they cross our border is pathetic.
Keep in mind that in her own example, the only law these asylum seekers broke was entry, and she claims that defense of asylum seekers is pathetic. I get that it's her opinion, and she does not necessarily speak for anyone else, but we can't ignore that sentiment must also exist in the minds of others. If she were consistent in criminalizing asylum seekers throughout history, she would be opposed to the Underground Railroad and to the harboring of Jews during the Holocaust. And if what I just said seems unreasonable or a leap of logic, let's zoom out from U.S. policy and understand that in terms of international law, when a state enacts laws that violate human rights, the state then operates in violation of international law. This means that it does not matter to international courts if policy in the U.S. changes to criminalize asylum seekers. International courts will recognize that breaking such laws will be understood as an act of self-defense.
People that come across our border illegally are not Americans, and they do not have rights here.
I think what I really need people to understand when we go through the rights acknowledged by the Bill of Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that when a nation strays in policy from the international standards, It's not an equal difference of opinion. It's one nation disagreeing with 192. It means that state operates in violation of international law. If human beings become criminalized in the US, then that means the US policy change is a criminal one. It is a crime of the state. And to be clear, forced displacement is recognized as a crime in international law. We'll get more into what exactly that means, I guess. We're probably going to have to break this into two sections. One, this today will just be what our rights are as human beings, and then I guess we will do a small and hopefully shorter caveat of all the ways in which ICE breaches human rights and breaks laws that are recognized both in the United States and in terms of international law. The US is not the king of the world. It is one of 193 member states who had a hand in guiding the respect and protection of universal human rights that we are about to go through. The US, or any other state, does not get to supersede that idea of human rights with its own policy. So we'll go over the relevant rights in terms of knock and talks that the US acknowledges as inalienable, again, cannot be alienated from, speaks for itself there, in the Bill of Rights, and then later we will do the same for the UDHR. Amendment 2 is the right to bear arms. This is the US acknowledging a right to self-defense to the extent of using lethal force. Amendment 4, this is the most important in terms of the waylays and knock and talks. So I'll read the full language and then summarize. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This is the U.S. acknowledgement of your right to security of your person as well as your personal property. We'll talk about how to assert this, as well as what tactics officers use to violate it in, I guess, the guide section of this essay. Amendment 5. This is the U.S. acknowledgement of your right to act in your own legal interest in the face of accusations. When agents or officers talk to you, they intend to find confessions of illegal behavior. You are not legally obligated to answer questions asked by them. Even if they have a warrant signed by a judge, you can plead the fifth and invoke your right to remain silent. However, you have to speak the words, I plead the fifth, or I don't answer questions, or I invoke my right to remain silent, in order for the courts to recognize this right. I do suggest speaking all three when relevant, and to record yourself speaking them. I guess we will dive deeper into that in the guide section of this essay. Amendment 6. This is the U.S. acknowledgement of a right to a fair trial when accused of a crime. This would apply after a confrontation with ICE. Unfortunately, the result is, when dealing with ICE, you are assumed guilty unless you can prove your documentation. This is why native-born U.S. citizens have been detained by ICE, so the U.S. does not acknowledge this as a human right when it comes to immigration policy. International law does respect this right, even though the U.S. does not. Amendment 8. This is the U.S. acknowledging your right to humane detention when detained. It prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. I guess we'll have to wait till later to get into why ICE is in violation of this amendment. All right. Amendment 13. This is the U.S. acknowledging a right to self-ownership, not to be enslaved. However, it explicitly does not extend to prisoners. So the ICE concentration camps will likely be slave labor camps, in my speculation. Again, this does not mean that you don't have the right of self-ownership against slavers. It is the U.S. stating that it does not protect that right when it comes to incarcerated people. Amendment 14. This is the U.S. acknowledging a right to citizenship for anyone born into the country. The current administration is attempting to repeal the acknowledgement of this right. That concludes the relevance of the Bill of Rights in the context of ICE knock and talks. We covered Article 1 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 2 simply clarifies that rights apply to all people. So Article 3. I'm just going to go through the official language of these for the UDHR. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. This means that even if the U.S. repeals the acknowledgement of the right to self-defense, international law sides with you in defending your right to life, liberty, and bodily security. Article 4. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all its forms. This indicates that the international courts oppose the incarceration slavery that the U.S. takes part in, that ICE aids in perpetuating. Article 5. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. Again, we'll pin in that. Article 6. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. ICE, being a systemically racist organization, dehumanizes minority groups and sees certain human beings as people who exist illegally. ICE, at its core, operates in violation of this right. Article 7. All are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement to such discrimination. Again, the assumption of guilt until proven documented is blatantly in violation of human rights because non-white citizens are targeted as potential immigrants and can be detained without due process. Article 9. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. I don't have to explain why ICE operates in constant violation of this right. Article 10. Everyone is entitled to full equality, to fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal, in the determination of his rights and obligations and of any criminal charge against him. Again, ICE detention subverts the due process described in Article 10, and therefore ICE operates in violation of human rights. Article 11, Section 1. Everyone charged with a penal offense has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, according to the law, and in a public trial at which he has had all the guarantees necessary for his defense. It's redundant to say that ICE fundamentally operates in violation of this right. Article 12. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference in his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. ICE knock and talks, as well as ICE raids, especially those without proper warrant, are a violation of this right. Article 13, Section 1. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Obviously, the mass deportation policies impede the right of residence and movement. Article 14, Section 1. Everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Section 2. This right may not be invoked in the case of prosecutions genuinely arising from non-political crimes or from acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. The conflict here is that ICE sees undocumented asylum seekers of Section 1 as the criminal exception granted in Exception 2. We're definitely going to get into that later. Article 17, Section 2. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. As we look at history, primarily the Underground Railroad and those who provided haven for the Jews in Nazi Germany, we see that oppressive regimes violate this right. People sympathetic to the hunted groups were ripped from their land and assets as arbitrary punishment for their dissent from unjust laws. That's going to conclude what's most relevant from the UN UDHR in the context of navigating ICE activity. However, I encourage the reading of each article in this declaration. It's important to note that international law sees that you have many more rights than the United States does. I also want to mention that there are 193 member states involved in the UN. Just to reiterate, this means that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was constructed and endorsed by many nations and is highly regarded in terms of international law as a legal standard to hold countries to. Thus, when a country's Bill of Rights conflicts with one of the articles in the UDHR, it is not a difference of opinion or a disagreement. That country chooses to selectively violate the standards under which nations are held. So if the U.S. fails to recognize a right listed in these articles, the U.S. is choosing to operate in violation of rights. It is not a disagreement. The U.S. labors to operate in ways that are morally wrong and legally criminal in terms of international human rights law.